and thank you for inviting me to have a speech. It's not a presentation, actually, but more of a speech. I'm going to start with the quote. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Martin Luther King Jr. said that. I know most of you sitting here are definitely not the silent type. So the reason I begin like this is definitely not an accusation. It's a thank you to many of the people sitting in this room. It's also a way to highlight what I want to talk about tonight, which is the power of words. But first I have to tell you a little bit about myself. I have a mother that has been extremely sick and bedridden with ME/CFS for about 7 years. I also happen to be a journalist, and this combination made me spend nearly 3 years writing a documentary book about this disease. Thousands of pages read, hundreds of hours of interviews with doctors, scientists, some of them are sitting here, patients, carers, nurses, politicians, lawyers, you name it. Some of you have seen me around at conferences the last couple of years, beginning in Reno in 2009. I haven't missed many since. The book was published 7 months ago. It's this one that Richard showed. And since then, there has been quite a lot of stir in Norway around ME/CFS. A big part of the blame for that I have to hand to those gentlemen over there by daring to give these patients big gun cancer drugs. It's a daring move, but a little bit more about that later. Like I said, I'm a journalist, and I'm sorry to say this, but ME/CFS is a great story, but it's been mostly untold. And that is what triggered my interest in the first place. Of course, like every good scientist, for those of you who are scientists here, you have learned to hate journalists. I don't blame you. But then again, even Rupert Murdoch hates journalists these days, so I guess we're good for something. But don't worry, I'm not going to try to teach you about science. I know my limitations. I'm going to talk to you about the most powerful weapon of all, words. When there is a lack of knowledge, everything comes down to words. How people talk about the disease defines how society acts towards the disease. On an important web page for Norwegian doctors, a GP was quoted with his opinion on ME/CFS. It's like this. Most women get this disease in their early 30s, before they settle down and get children. So it might be that the social pattern where women are expected to get an education before settling down is a burden that they do not tolerate that well. I don't think this theory is going to be our next Nobel Prize in medicine. But it's still there. This quote is still there on a web page that is supposed to educate Norwegian doctors on ME/CFS. These kinds of statements are purely based on preconceptions. There is no scientific evidence backing it up. In one of the books I read during my journalistic research, I found the story of Dr. Elizabeth Forsyth. And bear with me for quickly reading the passage about her in this book. She had symptoms of weakness and fatigue in medical school, and those worsened in residency training. The symptoms were always attributed to a lack of effort or resilience, or if a medical term were needed for someone without the guts to get on with it, neurasthenia. She had episodes of worsening after the birth of her 3 children. She was later referred to a psychiatrist, and when she needed bed rest, was thought to be depressed. Although an experienced physician, she ignored her own symptoms for a long time, rationalized them in various ways, and when given the diagnosis, admitted that she really didn't understand what it was all about. It is not difficult to understand why many patients also ignore and then rationalize their problems for a long time before presenting them to a physician. and then have little understanding of the nature of this diagnosis. I think I know what you're all thinking right now. It's a typical story, isn't it? You all heard it in your clinics or at the hospitals with your patients. It's typical ME/CFS. And you're absolutely right, except Dr. Forsyth didn't have ME/CFS. She told her story in The Guardian in 1979, and she had multiple sclerosis. So the book I was actually reading from is this. It's MS, The History of a Disease. And when you read the history of MS, you will be stunned by the similarities. But MS is still so very different. The medical world and society believes in MS, and they use different words. We talk differently about MS. And since we talk differently about it, society acts differently towards the disease. We have rehabilitation centers, own courses in medical school, hospitals filled with MS expert clinicians, drug development, billions of research dollars, and humility and respect. Words matter. Here in the UK, they did a study into GPs' attitudes towards ME/CFS. It's not so old, it was published in 2005. Only half of the GP respondents believed that ME/CFS actually exists. No one made that much fuss about it. But imagine the same study if you had the same results in multiple sclerosis or some other disease. What if a survey had concluded only half of the GPs believe that cancer actually exists? Imagine the headlines. In Norway, we had a similar survey in more than 300 GPs. Around 40% said they were sure ME/CFS was a psychiatric problem. The survey also showed that nearly half of the GPs in Norway were open to the possibility of ME/CFS being an imaginary problem. This is not okay, but no one wrote about it. No one talked about it in public. The union of the GPs stayed comfortably silent. A few years back, one of Norway's most prominent psychiatrists wrote in a newspaper that he couldn't understand why Norwegian health authorities said there was about 9,000 to 18,000 ME/CFS patients in Norway. In the article, he asked, seemingly angry, where does this number come from? Like the prevalence number was some kind of a joke. Well, as all of you here are aware of, it comes from prevalence studies. Several of them reproduced over time. It would have taken the angry professor 5 minutes to check this on PubMed, but he obviously didn't feel the need to do that, because he just knew. He didn't need to check the facts. He had an attitude. Why let knowledge ruin the fun in a heated discussion? It's not about finding the truth anymore then. It's more about winning the argument. And nothing is more powerful than words. It's not just words in the papers or on television and at conferences like this one. It's also words in the corridors, in the back rooms of the hospital, in closed meetings, at dinner parties. They are all powerful because it's words that give rise to attitudes and preconceptions. A Norwegian health worker told me that some doctors and researchers in Norway nicknamed the patients ME Talibans as a joke. They nicknamed the patients after the Taliban terrorists in Afghanistan because the patients evidently were such strong believers in having a physical disease. Of course, this is quite funny. I laughed. It's definitely funny if you imagine a Taliban guerrilla full of ME/CFS patients. Probably would have been awarded the Peace Prize. But we must be able to laugh at ourselves. But this laugh, this had a bitter aftertaste. Because when words stick as a stigma, it's just not right. So words matter. Professor in immunology Anthony Pinching wrote an article in Clinical Medicine in 2003 comparing the development in ME/CFS and AIDS, diseases who came to the attention of the medical establishment around the same time in the 80s. And Pinching wrote, whereas the prospects for people with AIDS have been completely transformed over some 15 years of pharmaceutical medicine and its products, those of their companions with ME/CFS remains little changed. Why? In the early days, in the 1980s, AIDS first and foremost hit the gay community in the US. This led to a lot of stigmatization. People died, but media wouldn't write about it, the medical world shied away from it, and money into research was lacking. All because of attitude and preconceptions. Knowledge was not driving the discussion. Some people even named it the gay plague and claimed the whole disease was because of injurious lifestyle and stresses of being gay. So obviously, medical hypotheses and moral judgments had become confused. All this happened while people were dying. We all know that this has changed in AIDS. With HIV being discovered, it was no longer justified to blame the patients, because we all tend to judge too easily, but moral judgments don't go well with a virus. Thinking back, the preconceptions around AIDS sounds absurd today. But for those of us knowing the prevailing situation in ME/CFS, it is not absurd. It is our lives. So when the urgency of people actually dying is not there, how long will it then take for a stigmatized group to be taken seriously? After the discovery of HIV, governments have spent billions of dollars funding research into AIDS. Great discoveries have been made. Patients have several treatment options. They live decent lives. It's a victory of science and medicine. Every single year, the National Institutes of Health spend about $3 billion on HIV/AIDS research. And every single year, they spend about $3 to $4 million on ME/CFS. To grasp the difference, try this. One single year of research into HIV equals about 1,000 years of research into ME/CFS. You can do the same comparison in multiple sclerosis. 1 year of research into multiple sclerosis, if you look at funding, equals about 40 years of research into ME/CFS. And this happens despite the fact that in scientific studies on functional impairment, ME/CFS ends up at the bottom of the list. In the last study where they used the SF-36 scale, for those of you who know that, the research concluded that ME/CFS, and I quote, has a greater impact on functional status and well-being than other chronic diseases such as cancer. This is not new. It was the same results on studies in the mid-90s. A lot of the ME/CFS patients are the sickest of the sick. So why the problem with preconception and negative attitudes? Because words matter. And when unjust is being done, it matters even more. However, enough complaining. Because I think the world of ME/CFS is actually about to change. I even talked to some people here today already that says the same thing. I hope they know what they're talking about. In May 2010, I met the psychiatrist Simon Wesley for an interview in his office in London. I remember it was right after the Invest in ME conference that year, and I had to jump on a plane back to London again. You're probably all familiar with Wesley. He's an influential and controversial scientist in ME/CFS because he has favored a more psychological view of the disease. And he has very much been a public figure promoting this view. I talked to Wesley for about an hour, or more accurately, he talked for about an hour. Well, most of the scientists do that when I talk to them. That's okay. I want them to talk. I'm not going to go into the interview with Professor Wesley here. Some of it is in my book, but I had an interesting farewell with him. I asked him if he thought there would be a medicine that would help ME/CFS patients in the future. And he said no, very abruptly. And then he added, not in my lifetime. I remember the answer. It surprised me a bit, because I felt he answered it like it was a threatening possibility, like that would ruin everything. And therefore, also adding, not in my lifetime, more like a preference than an actual prediction. If there would happen to be a medicine, then at least he wouldn't have to face questions around it if he was already gone. Because what if? What if they find a medicine? And that's why Bergen, a city on the west coast of Norway, plays such a big part in my book. And those two gentlemen sitting over there, still sitting over there. As you're all aware of, or at least most of you, I guess, in this room, Ola Mella and Øystein Fluge, they did a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical study on the drug rituximab in ME/CFS. It's a drug that wipes out the B cells in the immune system. The results turned out surprisingly promising. 67% of the patients on the drug got a significant improvement, nearly all of them a major improvement, compared to just 13% in the control group. It's a very significant result in a clinical study. It's a small study, so this is definitely not proven yet, but it's very promising. I followed their research since 2009, when I just started working on my book. Why I did that? Because even then, in the early days of the work of my book, I understood one thing already, that this could change everything. And after they published their study in PLOS ONE last fall, it generated a massive amount of media coverage in Norway, and also abroad. BBC, ABC News, and Der Spiegel all wrote about it. But the reaction in the magazine of the Norwegian Doctors Union was a funny one. They wrote 2 editorial pieces harshly criticizing the hype and more or less implied that it was irresponsible by everybody involved. Some doctors commented that these results were really not that important. Well, in my opinion, that's just wrong. Yes, the results definitely need to be confirmed in bigger studies. It's not proven yet, and the researchers have stressed that themselves. But this has the power to fundamentally change things. If a drug that wipes out the B cells in the immune system turns out to work in ME/CFS, or at least for quite a few of the patients, it will be bye-bye to those who argue that ME/CFS doesn't exist. It's easy as that. Another funny thing is this story has its parallel. When Professor Jonathan Edwards of University College in London was in the beginning of proving rituximab to work in RA, not many people believed him either. He ended up talking to the press because he saw no other way of getting attention and much needed funding for further trials. Like in Norway, quite a few people in the medical establishment got angry. The writer of an editorial in the British Medical Journal were outraged by the irresponsibility of Edwards talking to the press. But the attention led to the funding of a bigger study on rituximab in RA. And that study proved that Edwards was right. And it ended up as a paradigm shift in RA. In reply to the editorial in the British Medical Journal, Professor Edwards wrote that the direct result of the press coverage was that research finally would be accelerated. Until then, his ideas had been more or less ridiculed by the medical establishment for years. In short, Edwards wrote, the journalist who wrote the story caught the establishment napping. The scientists sitting in this room I've definitely not been napping when it comes to MECFS. Some of you have been screaming out loud for 25 years. It has been difficult waking up the rest of them. But I think now is the time. They say that truth goes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. I think MECFS is moving into the 3rd phase right now. I might be overly optimistic, but after following this closely for the last 3 years, I do think I can make an educated prediction. The point is, and I think I say this on behalf of all the patients and carers and friends and family of patients, the most important people are those who stayed in the field when it was, and to some extent still is, in stage 1, the ridiculing. When it was, and to some stage still is, in stage 2, the strong opposition. Quite a few of you are sitting here today. I want to take the opportunity to say thank you to all of you. The medical and scientific world needs people like you. And I know, because I talked to quite a few of you, that it's not easy. The easiest solution is always to give up, to go with the flow. But that's not really a solution, is it? MECFS is not going away. So as I said, I think we're finally set for stage 3. Why do I say that? Well, even though ending up in disappointment, XMRV created a lot of attention and renewed interest in MECFS. It hit the news big time and it generated a big momentum. The recent rituximab findings was a big splashing surprise and has spurred new interest from immunologists and other scientists. There is much more happening now than ever before in MECFS history. £1.5 million were recently given to biomedical research into MECFS here in the UK. In the US, the CFI initiative has a budget of $10 million. Dr. Peterson back there with Cimarron Research has a collaboration going with Bonn University. That's also here, I think. And they're digging into the immune system. Things are happening at Stanford, at Columbia, at Mount Sinai, and other world-leading scientific institutions. A lot of new top-notch scientists are talking about MECFS. It starts there, and then they're slowly getting involved. I also happen to know that there are people in this room that has a few interesting things up their sleeves in the weeks to come. I hope that this will lead to new findings, which again will lead to interest from more scientists, which again will lead to more money. My educated hunch is that we're now in the beginning of a self-perpetuating circle, a good one, finally. And I believe that the patients will get better treatment options, living decent lives. It will, again, be a victory of science over attitudes and preconceptions. And then society will start using different words when talking about MECFS. And, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, in my lifetime, please. Thank you.